for SESTA. And so a little bit about my previous experience was a trade manager for the state of Iowa, focused on Asia for several years, and a manager of their international business development. That was more on the foreign direct investment side. I am a lawyer by training and practiced for several years for the Davis Brown law firm, now Dentons Davis Brown in the international litigation divisions, and manage offices for Europe, Japan, China, Taiwan, and Mexico for the state of Iowa. Directed many governor-led trade missions. We still do trade missions. We're working on one even now. We do various trade missions for different states and counties throughout the U.S. Different governor appointments for the EU and Japan, and various presentations throughout Europe and Asia. I'm also an adjunct professor, or have been, for Drake University Law School, and also was a high school teacher. So I love teaching. This is my favorite part of my job, even though I do a lot of other cool stuff. And so I was telling Danielle prior to the call that this is so hard for me to kind of talk about, just, the what of export readiness training, but not the how. So this course, we really talk about the what, right? Like 9 topics to kind of let you kind of understand what is required for exporting, but not how to do it. And the teacher in me, I just want to say how so bad, but you're in luck. We do have, as Danielle mentioned, an export readiness training that is going to be happening this spring. The dates are already set. We already have several companies signed up. We're almost at capacity. So if you're interested, please sign up, talk to Danielle. And so it's going to be May 8th, the 15th, and the 22nd. We take 4 hours of your morning, so 12 hours total. The trainings include 3 sessions, 4 modules, 4 hours each. And you learn, about exporting from start to finish. So it's a great course. And you get a little certificate to show, like, oh, you know how to export. So that's fun too. So I just want to throw that out there if anyone is interested. A little bit more about the class. The topics include, a lot of topics like developing an export plan, classifying your products, market research. We go all over the internet. I might just show you tons of free resources for you to really understand your markets and figure out which markets you should be in. And then we talk about the various export assistance and service providers. We also talk about free trade agreements and foreign import requirements, pricing your products for export markets, finding partners and buyers, and then using Incoterms and pro forma invoices. And then we get into the nitty-gritty with navigating shipping and logistics. Then we get into really detail about the different certificates you need, phytosanitary certificates, sanitary certificates, FDA certificates, and teach you how to do that. And then different export documentation, and then sales, financing, payments, and that kind of stuff. So once again, if you just joined us, this is really the curriculum for the 12-hour course that's happening in May. You can sign up. You can just email Danielle. She'll send you a questionnaire just so we kind of understand where you're at, and you can kind of see where you're at, prior to the course. And then it's a great course because you get handouts, right? So we may go all over the internet, but you'll have the links in your handout. You'll have explanations. They really summarize the course. And we have so many people come back and say to us, well, I used my handout, 2 years later. I pulled out that handout and I got some guidance, and so I used those links, and you get some homework. It's fun homework, though. It kind of helps you to utilize the stuff you learned. Finally, just like this presentation today, it's very interactive, and we bring on seasoned exporters that tell you, the glory of exporting and their triumphs, and then some of their defeats, because sometimes you have, you take it on the chin and you get back up. And so we're happy to have seasoned exporters, and we also bring in industry experts. We usually have a freight forwarder or an international banker come in so you can pick their brains too. And then you get a certificate. So once again, this is just, different companies that have taken it have given positive feedback. So just want to go ahead and say, if you do want to sign up for the course, we have limited space. It starts, once again, May 8th. There's 3 different sessions, but I want to encourage you to go and sign up because we really want to have educated exporters who can build a pipeline to utilize SESTA's great programs, right? So just want to throw that pitch out there as we continue to get people on the call, and then we'll go ahead and start the session in earnest now. So for this topic, this webinar, we're going to cover classifying products for export, export plan and foreign market research, free trade agreements and why they're necessary, foreign import requirements, pricing products for export, finding partners and buyers, pro forma invoices and Incoterms, shipping and logistics, and export payments, financing, insurance. So once again, this is a very high level course because you're like, how do you cover 9 topics in 1 hour? Well, we do that because it's very high level. And once again, this webinar shows you what, but not how. We teach you how in the 12-hour course that's coming up. So let's go ahead and get started. So one of the first things you need to do when you're learning to export or when you start to export is to classify your products for export. So this is a pretty easy step, but it's very important. You need to classify your products mainly for one thing, to conduct market research. So if you want to go ahead and, explore different markets and, do the market research to see how your product actually trends in different markets, whether there's trending upwards, see the sales or exports for a certain number of years, you need to go ahead and have your classification codes. So then also, if you want to check out your industry, sorry, and see how your industry has fared over several years, you want to go ahead and also classify your product for your product and then your industry. So an example here, we might have coffee. That's my product. So I'll go ahead and classify my product, for coffee. And then let's go ahead and say my industry might be, let's go broader and say coffee, but let's say hot beverages or something like that. And you can go ahead and kind of research how your industry is doing as a whole. So what are classification codes? Really, they're numerical identification codes used nationally and internationally, right? So they're usually harmonized, right? So, you're using the classification code and usually it's the same one that when you're shipping your products abroad, you'll use that same code. It's used to market, to pull data for market research. And then once again, for that full course, we teach you a lot of tools and show you different ways you can pull market research and data. And then, it helps you to ship your goods overseas. Because when you ship your goods, they're going to have to go ahead and, assess tariffs or import taxes on your goods. And that's determined by the classification code, right? So you need it when you ship, but then you also need it to pull market research. The major types of code that we kind of cover, that the most important ones, will be the HS code. And the HS code will be the first 6 digits of the 10-digit Schedule B number. Okay, so the full 10 digits of your code for your product will be, the Schedule B number. And then if you take the first 6 digits, that's the HS code. Now, sometimes when you do market research, they'll have you put your 6-digit number in. They'll tell you to put your, HS code in to go ahead and find information about your product. Sometimes they'll have you put your full Schedule B number. The longer the number, the more detailed information they have about your product. Okay. So example, this is one for coffee, right? And so the first 6 digits right here would be the HS code. The first 10 digits would be the Schedule B number. And then this 10 tells me that it's organic coffee. So it tells me a lot about it. This whole number means roasted, organic, coffee essentially. So, you can get more detailed as you keep going into the Schedule B number. But once again, main reason is to pull market research. You also have NAICS codes. We show you how to find your NAICS code because some of the tools to pull market research will have you pull it by your industry. And we'll talk about doing industry research versus like product research. But it's very important sometimes just to see how your industry as a whole is trending. How are sweet, confectionery products trending as a whole in Asia, right? Or as a whole in Japan versus like your particular product. And both of these codes are actually managed and put up by the U.S. Census Bureau. Once again, I'm just telling you overview, high level. During the other course, we'll actually kind of go in. I'll show you online how to pull the numbers and get the information. But this is basically what you need to know about classifying your products. It's a very important step. The next important step that is so important, I want to stress this, is having an export plan and doing foreign market research. Usually I teach these in 2 separate courses because there's so much, but I've kind of condensed them here. But the export plan is very important because you want to guide your export activities, right? You don't want to just be all willy-nilly. Someone sends you an email from the Philippines, you're like, that sounds good. And then someone sends you an email from, some other source, or let's say China, and you're like, oh, that sounds good, right? Not only do you want to be able to take advantage of those opportunities by doing foreign market research and understanding them if you do have an opportunity, but you want a structured course, right? You want to determine, carefully which markets you want to enter into and do some research about those markets. And so this is what's going to help you. Having an export plan so you can be proactive and you say, oh, I think I want to go ahead and go into these three markets, right? And then having the ability to do foreign market research to determine those three top markets, right? But then for any opportunity that comes your way, you're at a trade show and you get an opportunity that comes from Brazil. And you're like, well, I don't know what's required for Brazil. I don't know if my product is doing well. Well, you can do that foreign market research, right? And be prepared and knowledgeable. So they kind of go hand in hand. A lot of times what you want to do when you actually do foreign market research that will actually inform your export plan is you want to conduct an industry analysis as a whole. How does your whole industry fare? How is it doing? Is it going upward? Is it trending downward? Are there reasons why? Is it because some kind of artificial trade barrier? Is it just because the tastes are just different and just have shifted in the last couple of years and you didn't know about it? So really undoing the industry analysis is very important. And we show you how, but this is just a good topic that you should consider. This helps to identify growing, emerging, and successful markets. Also, it helps you identify some markets you just shouldn't bother with, right? So you're just like, well, it seems like this whole industry is on decline in this country. Let's go ahead and turn our attention to another country where, the industry is actually doing well. Once you kind of look at your industry as a whole, now you want to do the research to look at your target markets, right? So, you kind of want to start narrowing down. So, this helps you determine the best four markets where you want to spend your time, spend your energy. So, you can narrow down to your top 10, then also narrow it down a little bit more to your top five and then top three. So, you can kind of really focus your efforts. You're not all out all over the world willy nilly. So you want to determine markets that have been most successful and fast growing, all right, for your product. And then finally, once you kind of narrow it down, let's say you have a top five, you need to do a deeper dive. You need to understand the business culture, the environment. Okay. Do they, is there some kind of culture that you have to kind of adhere to? Are there certain kind of colors you don't want to use, right? Do you have to translate some of your products? Something like that. You want to kind of have a better understanding of that market, do a deeper dive so you can kind of narrow it down, right? So this helps you have a better understanding of the market. You can research the business environment. Is it business friendly? Are there a lot of, kind of artificial trade barriers? Is the culture amenable to you and your product? Things like that. And you can realize obstacles and narrow down your options. Finally, when you're, kind of looking at your plan as a whole, once again, this is just a tiny bit of a portion of the plan that you're going to put together, which we teach you how to do in the full course. But you also want to think about free trade agreements. Very important. We're going to talk about a little bit more, I think, in topic 3 of this webinar. But they really help reduce or eliminate tariffs, right? Tariffs is pretty much a tax on an imported good. Sometimes when you ship your products abroad, they can slap on a tariff and it can be 40%, 50%. Sometimes it may be 12%, but no matter what, that means your product is going to be sitting on the shelf, barring anything else in that foreign country at a higher price. All right, because the importer is going to pass that cost usually on to the consumer, right? So when you have a free trade agreement and it's zero tariffs assessed for your products when it's imported in, it just levels the playing field with the domestic market, right? And also makes you become more competitive. So we'll talk about free trade agreements a little bit more in a second, but that's part of your market research and your market analysis, right? So a lot of times people will take all of these different resources and information. Like I said, we give you resources in the other course, and you're able to kind of, formulate your export plan based on this analysis and that analysis and free trade agreements. What are the best markets for you to focus your attention? And honestly, during the first session, we give you homework, so you actually do it. You actually come up with like your top 3 markets. So anyway, but let's go ahead and the moment after you go ahead and look at your various markets and do your market research, you next want to look at your product and do a product assessment. And this is so important. You can't skip this, right? Because I always say, you don't want all your babies on the market at the same time. Sometimes you don't, right? You just don't want, if you have like 12 products, sometimes you don't want just all 12 products all willy-nilly all over the world. You want to maybe be very, very conscious about, we're going to start exporting with these two products, this one product, or something like that, right? Just so you can be, in control of it and understand. So you want to do a product assessment. Usually you'll be listing, the product, the strengths, the weaknesses, and the reason why you'll find export success. Sometimes when you're looking at a product or doing a product assessment, you're just thinking to yourself, well, this product will require the least amount of modifications. Or if we have to modify this product, which a lot of times you might have to, we'll talk about that with foreign import requirements. This will be, cause the least amount of headache for us to modify. If we have to strip this out, this product will be easier to do that. If we have to change the flavoring because, we figured that Japan don't like hot, but Brazil likes it hot or something like that, this product will be easy for us to kind of tweak if we need to, or we have to strip additive or something like that because of foreign import requirements. So whatever you think your product is, your strengths or weaknesses, this is an important step to go ahead and look at. Right. So, because a lot of times when you export to a foreign country, they're going to have their certain requirements, and you want to make sure it's a product that not only has interest in the foreign market that someone will want to buy, but then also that it's a good product and it's a good fit. So, this is an important step too when you're putting together your export plan and doing market research. So, based on the reasons for potential export success, you want to decide whether you believe that one or more of your products will have exporting potential. Now, if you do an assessment, you're like, well, all 5 of my products or all 10 or 12 of my products should just go out there, then that's fine. But once again, different regions have different tastes, different requirements. So this is a very important step. So we talked a little bit about free trade agreements, but let's do a deeper dive. Once again, free trade agreements are very important because they can reduce, the tariffs or eliminate them altogether. So that makes you more competitive. They usually you'll find information about them from the International Trade Administration. Each free trade agreement will have their own rules to qualify. This is very important, right? Because you can't just be like, well, the U.S. has a free trade agreement with Japan. I'm going to just go and ship my product. No, you got to figure out how you qualify, right? It's very important. Or the U.S. has a free trade agreement with Australia. I'm just going to ship my product. That does not work. So the rules, there's a rules of origin for each free trade agreement. And usually in the other course, we tell you a deep dive on how to actually qualify, whether it's regional value content, whether it's a tariff shift, whether it's wholly produced, whether it's de minimis. There's some kind of way that you're saying that your product qualifies, right? And you need to go ahead and prove that. So this is a caveat. That's a lot more into it, but you usually have to qualify your product and you usually have to provide proof that your product qualifies, right? And under what criteria you're using based on a free trade agreement. There's a lot of online tools, and we kind of give this to you in the other class about information and also the tariff rates. So you want to make sure before you say, we have a free trade agreement with Japan, let's go ahead and use that. You want to make sure your product will actually benefit, because for each one of these free trade agreements, sometimes the tariff is reduced, but it's not eliminated, right? So you want to make sure you do your due diligence. There's a lot of online tools, very easy, and you kind of go in there and you check and see with your particular product under that specific free trade agreement, whether your tariff goes from 30% to zero, right? Or 12% to zero, or 12% to 6%. It's still a good drop, but you want to make sure that you understand how you will, benefit, or how it's going to benefit your product, and determine the tariff rate. So this is just a very important exercise. For the U.S., there are 20, they have 14, I believe, with 20 countries. So Australia, Bahrain, Chile, you have CAFTA, DR, which is Costa, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Colombia, Israel, Jordan, South Korea, Morocco, Oman, Panama, Peru, Singapore. As most of you all know, you have the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA in 2020. And then there is one for Japan. It's called a trade agreement, not free trade agreement, because it's a narrow one that only covers ag and food products. And so that was put into effect in 2020. So once you're kind of doing your export plan, looking at your market research, you want to consider these free trade agreements. But as I just said, there are rules and regulations and processes. You need usually some kind of certification of origin or certificate of origin. You need some things to make sure you qualify. So, make sure that you can understand how you utilize them. So finally, once you kind of go ahead and pull all that research together, right, you want to determine the largest, fastest growing, and simplest market to penetrate. Now, that's not always easy, right? What's the largest? So I have, the largest, amount of kind of consumers to pull from. What's the fastest growing? So it's trending upwards, and I know I'm going to be on the upward trend. What's the simplest? I do not have to modify my product 100 times. Maybe I just have to translate my label, but that's it, something like that, right? And then you want to go ahead and target and define which market to pursue. Sometimes it's best to test one market, and we see this all the time. For that main course, we'll bring in the seasoned exporter, and they have all kinds of strategies, right? They're seasoned exporters. They're in like 100 countries. But sometimes when you're just starting out, it's best to test one market and then move on to a secondary market as your expertise develops, right? And sometimes we see companies and they'll go ahead and focus on a regional geographic cluster, right? So you'll be like, I think the Middle East will be a good market, right? I just have to change all my language, to one language and that kind of stuff. So let me go ahead and just look at Saudi Arabia, UAE, and all that kind of stuff. However, we're going to talk about it in the next section, foreign import requirements. Just because you're in a geographic region, right, and there's a cluster, does not mean that each country doesn't have its own requirements. And two countries side by side, Saudi Arabia and UAE, one allows one additive, one doesn't. One allows one thing, one doesn't, right? So still, even though you say, oh, I just have to translate in one language and this is going to be easy and blah, 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 I'm going to just look at this whole region. You still need to check the foreign import requirements, which we'll talk about in 1 second, for each country, right? To make sure that, you get your product in. And so it could be more cost effective. But if you still have to make all these product modifications within the region, it might be better to just go ahead and look somewhere else or be scattered. So it's just, an assessment that you make after you do your foreign market research, right? So let's talk about foreign import requirements. They are so important. And I want to stress this because we even have seasoned importers or exporters come on the call, and they'll tell their stories, and you're just like, wow, right? About foreign import requirements because they do all this legwork and they do all this work, and then they find out the foreign import requirement, and they're like, oh, we can't even go into this market. All right, so check them first, right? So every country region, in the world will have import requirements that must be adhered to, right? So if you want to get your products in, you're going to have to modify your product or have some kind of certification or have some kind of, ingredient list or whatever they require to get your product in there, right? Just like the US wants to go ahead and protect its citizens, make sure there's nothing, bad coming in, every country wants to do the same. And sometimes it could just be a protectionist stance where they just want to protect their industry, right? But whatever the reason, if you don't comply, if you don't change your product, modify it, if you don't have a certain label, if it's not translated, something like that, your product's not getting in. So these are important to learn more about product packaging, labeling, certification, and shipping requirements. Normally, like I said, in the 12-hour course that's coming up, we cover the FAIR's country reports and the FAIR's certificate report in great detail, put up by the USDA. We show you how to find them and really understand them. But here, high level, just making sure that you understand that if you're going to export your product, you have to understand foreign import requirements. Okay, the understanding of this is very important because they can add extra costs, right? If you have to modify your product or strip away something that's not supposed to be there, or change this or get another certificate you weren't expecting, it can cost and it can add, extra resources. And you might want to have to, of course, readjust your pricing to take that into effect, right? So one quick example, we had a seasoned exporter come in, a little bit of time ago, and he said he was looking at Japan. And they had made inroads in Japan and they had worked on this in Japan because a lot of times Japan is more like you had to build those relationships over a long period of time. They did that. They did that. They finally, kind of figured out the foreign import requirement. And for Japan, you have to do an ingredients list and you have to do a manufacturing process list. And they said, oh, we're not willing to do that. So they just abandoned ship. Now, of course, hundreds of thousands of companies decide to do it every day. What their personal choice was and the reason why, that's up to them. But if they would have just checked the foreign import requirement, it's right there. It says right there. You know, you have to have an ingredient list. You have to have a manufacturing processing list. It could have saved them all the trouble of building those inroads and doing all this work and making all those connections if they would have said the foreign import requirements first. So once again, this is a very important step. And in real life, it's something that you really have to do. So let's just kind of talk over a high level. This whole class is high level. Some of the foreign import requirements that you will see once you start studying the reports and doing your due diligence. First thing, there might be an ingredients and manufacturing process list where you have to list your ingredients or you have to, list your manufacturing process and provide that when you ship your product. Sometimes it's about labeling. A lot of countries have different labeling. You kind of know normally you have to put it in the local language, right? The labels. I think that's kind of understood, right? But sometimes you don't. And sometimes there's a lot more labeling. You have to use certain kind of metrics to calculate the calories, or sometimes they need these kind of warnings on it and not this warning. So you need to make sure you understand. Packaging is such a big one nowadays. There's so many countries saying no wooden crates. If it's, you have wooden crates, you have to show some kind of, symbols that it's been fumigated and all this kind of stuff. And you have to put on all these recycling kind of little things on your packaging. There's so many different rules and regulations that are coming up more and more and more, which is why even if you shipped your package to the same country 2 years ago, you want to double check those foreign import requirements, right? And then also talk to your person on the ground, your importer, because they know a lot too, and making sure that there's not anything you're missing. Food safety, there's always tons of things about additives, as you can imagine, right? I mean, there's so many different additives or pesticides or color or something, and they will spell out to the nth degree what is allowed, what is not allowed, if you have, there's a process for it to be emitted or not, and all that kind of stuff. But you want to make sure you understand that. The next thing we're going to, especially for food, we'll talk about a little bit more in a second, the next slide. But sanitary certificates, if you have any kind of meat product, you usually need to have some kind of like that certificate. Are phytosanitary. If you have any non-processed fruits or vegetables, you're going to need a phytosanitary certificate, the APHIS certificate, right? Where they actually do an inspection and give you a certificate before your product is exported. So that's very important because that can be time, right? You have to have everything in a certain time frame and have all your ducks in a row and that kind of stuff. Export certifications, they'll specify. Some countries you need like a FDA certificate for any shelf-stable product like the UAE. Other countries like Japan, you don't need that at all. Some countries you need a certificate of export from a U.S. Chamber of Commerce like UAE. Japan, you don't need that at all. How do you know, right? Unless you check, and you must check. So, import procedures, duties, documents, rules of origin, they'll kind of talk about, and then trade facilitation. But these are all very important things to look at. A little deeper dive about export certifications. The sanitary certificate, there's a whole process. You make sure you kind of understand it. If you have meat products, normally you're going to have several different, kind of like certificate of wholesale, certificate of something or other that, you may need. For phytosanitary, and that's usually, like I said, goods that are, vegetables and fruit that's not processed, you're going to need some kind of certificate there. And then sometimes for all other products that are shelf stable, so that's like if you have popcorn, if you have whatever, right? Chips, doesn't matter. A lot of countries will go ahead and have you get a certificate of free sale from the FDA. In that main course I talked about, we go over in a deep dive of how to get all these certificates, but this is just a, high level kind of, of the typical certificates you might need. Then once again, a lot of times you'll need a certificate of origin for some countries from a U.S. chamber, not to be confused with a certificate of origin that you might need for a free trade agreement. That is self-certifying. You certify it for yourself. But if they ask for a certificate of origin for the country to admit your product without a free trade agreement, usually it needs to come or be issued by a US chamber. So a lot of nuances once again, but I just want to make sure you kind of understand, a little bit about some of the export certifications you might need. So let's move on quickly to pricing products for export. This is very important, right? Because if you don't price right, you may not sell, right? Or you might sell, but you might sell at a loss, which no one wants to do. So really understanding how to price your products for each market. And I want to stress that because everyone wants to say, well, Victoria, how do I export? And it's like, export to where, right? The import requirements for one country is going to be different from the next. Your pricing strategy for one country might be different from the next, right? So really everything is really market specific in exporting, and pricing your product is no different. So you want to examine the export pricing and quoting from in your company, right? To develop your export strategy. You want to think about, like the costs associated with, maybe foreign advertising or production or modifications and all that great stuff from within your company. But you also need to think about the landed cost, and that's the price externally represented to the buyer. Okay, because oftentimes when you start tacking on tariffs and you start tacking on other taxes and just the shipments and all that kind of stuff, logistical things, all that stuff adds up. And so normally the landed cost of the buyer can be really high. And we're going to see an example of that. And you want to make sure you go ahead and take that into account. So just like in the domestic market, if you price too high, your product will not sell, right? And that's not what anyone wants, right? And if you price too low, you may not be profitable. And that's why we're here, right? So you want to find that balance for each market to make sure you kind of really understand that you're going to make money. So there's a few considerations you want to consider when you price your products because you're developing a pricing strategy. So for whichever market you go into, you can use these tools to go and determine the best price, right? So you don't lose your shirt, right? In some market, and you want to make sure that you kind of thought this through. The first thing will be foreign market objectives. You should always have some kind of objective that you know or is very clear in your mind when you go into a foreign market. That could be as simple as, okay, it's a new market, so I have to price myself very competitively. I want to just break into this market. Other ones, maybe I'm here for quite some time, so I just want to increase my market share, right? So maybe that's a different strategy. Another strategy is you have surplus production and you're now looking for an outlet for your surplus production. So in that case, your pricing may be a little lower, but as cautionary tale, if you start lower in one market, it's very hard to start kind of ratcheting the prices up, right? So you want to be very strategic, but really think about it. What is my objective going into this foreign market? That's one piece of your analysis. The next one you want to really think about high level is market demand. Is there a demand for my product in this market? Are there people willing to buy my product? Okay, check yes. Can people afford my product? Okay, check yes. Then we're good to go, right? We have some kind of market demand. There's a demand for my product, and there's people on the ground who can afford my product. You'll look at different things. You'll be looking at like maybe per capita income, or if you're a very specialty, expensive niche product, like some very fancy mustard or something, you might have to say, okay, I need a good expat community, right? And the market that might be able to afford this. Or I'm looking for a younger, youthful market, more college students. I want to make sure that they're there. So you want to make sure you take the time to do that. And that'll be part of your pricing strategy. Another important thing is competition. No one exports in the bubble. You cannot pretend that you don't have competitors, right? And so if your competitors are pricing some kind of way, you better believe you better know about it, right? So you can go ahead and be competitive with them and understand, like, what is the going rate with your competitors for your product in a certain market. So very important to understand. And then finally, which we're going to talk more about, is the actual cost, right? What are the actual costs to export your product? There's so many different things to think about. I'll show you a list in a second, but that also, because you want to make sure you account for those costs when you export. So when you look at this whole thing and you start developing your pricing strategy, so you're really good at it. So you have something come from Australia, you can price it for that. Japan, you can price it for that. These may result in export prices that are different from domestic prices. They're almost always different from domestic prices. And then they may vary widely from each other in different markets. Your pricing for one country may be very different from the other, right? And so that's something you should consider. Now, going back to landed costs, we talked about it a little bit, just is so high level. So I'm just really talking about it at such a high level. But the landed costs, once again, they can add additional costs, right? And these are typically borne by the importer. You don't normally pay for the landed costs unless you choose an Incoterm that makes you DDP, which we'll talk about. But normally they're borne by the importer. But you can't say, okay, all the taxes and tariffs, I don't have to pay for that. Why should I care? Because it's going to be passed along to your consumer, and it will greatly affect how much your pricing is sitting, how much your product is sitting on the shelf and how much it costs there. So it can greatly add to the final price paid, and sometimes it can be double what is charged in the US. These include tariffs, custom fees, transaction costs like shipping and value added taxes, and the like. So a little example I like to give, let's say, at your facility you have 500 units at $50 each, so that's 25,000, right? But when you start tacking on freight, and let's say there's a customs fee of 22%, and let's say you tack on insurance and you tack on a tariff, and we just have here 10%. Like I said, tariffs can be 50%, they can be much higher. This is a very reasonable tariff, to be honest. So that adds another $2,500. Your total landed cost now is $29,400, right? So now your per unit cost, instead of $50, is $58.80. That's minus tacking on any other costs associated with exporting your product, not paying the commission to your people on the ground, not paying for the labels to be modified, not modifying the taste to fit the market, nothing else. Just the landed cost of the buyer can put that price so far over. That's why you want to consider this also when you're pricing products. And then finally, we talked about cost or operating expenses, things you want to think about. These are just a few things. There can be so many more, but fees for market research and credit checks, if you're going to pay for that. Business travel expenses, if you're going to go ahead and go and visit the country on the ground. Promotional material, translation costs, commissions, training costs for foreign reps, legal, patent, and trademark fees, taxes, export related insurance, product modification, special packaging, and then all the other fees, like, some things that are passed through for the importer, but you still want to take them into account. So this is just a high level explanation of pricing products, just to get you to think about some of the things you want to consider. We rounded it up. We have about a few topics to go. Our next topic is finding partners and buyers, right? So there's two ways you can usually kind of sell your product abroad. Sometimes people want to do indirect selling, where you're not dealing directly with the buyer and using an intermediary such as an export management company. Sometimes, that may be popular. Oh, wait, I think I have a question. Okay, so quick question here. I will just go ahead and answer it. The customs and brokerage fees seem to be the highest additional cost, but looks like there's no way around it. Is it goal to negotiate rates with specific private brokers, or the buyers already have one? That's a very good point. So a lot of times for the customs and brokerage fees, we'll talk about this when we talk about navigating global shipping. Sometimes your importer or buyer will have their preferred people they want to work with, right? And they'll go ahead and stress, I want this person. I want to go ahead and utilize this person. First off, this person will make sure that the product gets in. They know all the nuances, they know the people on the ground at the customs port and that kind of stuff. And so a lot of times those prices can be negotiated, usually in that kind of way. However, if you use a larger kind of shipper or freight forwarder, sometimes they have their built-in customs broker, relationship. Like if you go with FedEx, a lot of times it's kind of hard to ask FedEx, well, can you go ahead and use this broker? They'll go ahead and have their kind of built-in system. So in that case, you can't really negotiate or anything like that. But if you go ahead and use a smaller freight forwarder, And you can ask them, and you can just say, especially with a smaller one, we usually have a freight forwarder come for our live sessions that we're going to have soon, and they'll be on. They'll say, sure, if the buyer has a customs broker, and kind of has a relationship, and usually it's maybe still the fees are negotiated and they're almost guaranteed to help kind of get that product in, a smaller freight forwarder can kind of go ahead and do that. So normally the buyer will have one. If they have one that they like and you go with a smaller freight forwarder to ship your product, they can use that one. If you go with the bigger ones, usually it's kind of like whatever they have in their pipeline, they kind of use that one. But a lot of times, depending on the Incoterm, those fees are paid by the importer, like we just said. So a lot of times you won't be paying those fees. However, basically they're still going to be passed along. So, but thank you for the question, and super helpful. Thank you. If you have questions as we go along, don't feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat before I move on to another topic. So once again, we're talking about, buyers and partners and buyers. So a lot of times, let's say it's a new market and you were like, wow, this market is very complex, because every market is different, right? Some markets you're like, oh, this is easy. But you're like, oh, wow, this is so many regulations. There's so much difference. And there's a whole protocol. I have to, use distributors that are approved by this or that. You just never know, right? So sometimes you might want to use indirect selling, where you're not actually selling directly, but an export management company is helping you. Okay. And you can do that in certain markets. And there's a lot available. We go into this in great detail in the main course. However, sometimes, or oftentimes, that's why you're here, you're going to be direct selling. And direct selling is when you're directly dealing with the buyer, right? You are taking the legwork. You don't have like a de facto export company, that's handling your sales to, like, let's say South Korea. You are actually doing it yourself. And that's going to be, most everyone here and most markets. And so that way you're dealing directly with the buyer. You have some advantages. There's more control, there's higher profits, lower prices because you're not paying a commission, or, an extra person's not handling it. You can be more competitive. And this, I think, is the most important thing: close contact with customers in the market. Just like the US, markets change all the time. And what might be in favor now, 5 months from now, may not. The temperature of your clientele has changed. Your customers' tastes have changed. And when you're able to do direct selling, you're closer to the market. You kind of understand that a little bit more. So that's very helpful. The disadvantages, of course, could be that it takes more time to do direct selling. Hence, that's why you're here. You have to have more knowledge, more personnel, more resources, longer time for product awareness, right? You have to kind of be shaking the leaves yourself, or your distributor or whatever help you have on the ground to promote your product, to show people why it's better, to have people taste tested in the stores or something like that, right? And sometimes you may have less knowledge and experience than doing indirect selling. There's no right or wrong answer, and different markets, you can choose different strategies. And we see people do it all the time. They'll say, well, Canada, I got this. I'm going to do direct selling. South Korea, I'm going to have someone do indirect selling just for a time. And then I'll go and take over that market in 2 years or so when I understand it a little bit better. But those are the kind of two different types of partners. When you go ahead and let's say you're doing direct selling, you need to go ahead and find a channel of distribution. And these can be sales reps, right? So sales reps can be out there selling for you. This is the best bread ever, Agents. Now, agents are a little bit different. And, it's important you understand the difference and do your due diligence, do your research. Agents usually have, the power to bind you, where sales reps do not, right? You want to make sure you understand the nuances of who you're hiring, what are their limitations, what are they able to bind you to, and that kind of stuff. Distributors normally take title of your product. Retailers, you can always now sell, usually a lot of times directly to retailers. And then now with the online services, you can do end users too. But usually you're using a combination of these people to go in and help you on the ground. So there's a lot more nuances about this. So this is, once again, very high level. So you want to make sure you really understand who you're hiring. And like I said, whether, their limitations and the benefits of hiring them. But a few things to consider with anyone you hire. Okay. You want to consider the size of the sales force. If it's just two men in a little tiny office or someone's home office plugging away, if that works for you, that's fine. But if you expect two men to cover like the whole of Japan, that might be hard, right? So you want to make sure you ask, what's the size of your sales force? Sales records, ask them for sales records. Let them prove what they've done in the past, especially if they're going to be selling your product, right? Territorial analysis. This is very important because most countries are very large. Take, for instance, US. Do you want someone just to, sell in, let's say the East Coast? Or do you want someone to be responsible for the whole of US? Right? Because the South US is different from the Northeast US and the West US. It is a huge country. Same thing like the US, you want to do that same territorial analysis for every country you're looking at and see, am I hiring this person, just for Canada, just Toronto? Or are they also going to help me in, Quebec? Are they also going to help me in other places? Make sure that's spelled out somewhere and you're very clear. The product mix, are they only selling your product? Do they have other types of products? And do the products conflict? Are they selling competitive products to yours? And how does that work? You need to ask those questions, right? Facilities and equipment, especially for distributors, because they usually will take title to your product. They'll go ahead and buy a lot of it, and then they'll go ahead and kind of sell it on to retailers. So they're storing your product, in the foreign country. If your product has to be has to have cold storage, you better believe you need to understand whether they have cold storage, right? We had one seasoned exporter come on and said, they use a distributor, they thought everything was okay. Then they find out that all the bottles burst because they either it was too hot in there or they didn't have air conditioning, wasn't climate controlled, and they never bothered to check. So everything was kind of ruined. That's something you want to double check, especially for food, right? What are their facilities? What is their equipment and that kind of stuff? Marketing policies. If you actually go ahead and have someone sell for you, you better know how they're going to market. Are they going to hire some influencers on Instagram? Are they going to have people actually out there, in the stores doing taste tests? What are they doing? And you want that spelled out. What have they done in the past, right? Looking at customer profiles. Ask them, what have you done in the past? Can you give me a couple of customers that you've actually done this for so I can see, right? Have you ran commercials? What type? And then going to that is their promotional thrust. Now, which is kind of like the power they have to promote your product. Now, once again, this is high level, so I can't get into everything, but you have to do your due diligence. You need to always have some things like, the ending date and termination date. We have so many people come on here that we teach and they have open-ended contracts like forever with a distributor they don't even like anymore, but they're paying them for 5 years because they never decide to put in that contract when it's terminated. Things like that. You need to do your due diligence, right? Things like, like putting out like metrics. Like you need to sell this many per quarter, having them on some kind of like, initial plan. Like, okay, we'll do a trial period for 6 months. Something the same way that you do your due diligence in the US, you need to do the same way abroad, right? It's very important because sometimes the laws and things are different and you can be stuck paying and it's just because you didn't take the time to really understand and solidify and codify your contract in some kind of way, right? Very important. Finding buyers is the fun part, in my opinion. I love trade missions and trade shows and that kind of stuff. So, but finding buyers, there's a lot of in buyer buyers programs, trade missions, trade shows. A lot of times you can promote your product on different websites. There's a lot of networking events and that kind of stuff. We usually will recommend, having, utilizing the services for SUSTA. SUSTA has all these events and more every year, and that's a great source for finding your buyers, a great starting point. The key point is to do your market research so you can be intentional when trying to find your buyers, right? And understanding and being smarter about who you want to go ahead and sell your products to and where. So let's hurry it up. I think I'm going to finish in time. So pro forma invoices, that's very important because once you go ahead and you have your buyer and you're so excited, and so now you need to start putting things on paper, right? To go ahead and, kind of like have it memorialize the transaction, you want to use a pro forma invoice when you export. So it's a quotation prepared in the format of an invoice, and it's the preferred method in the exporting business. So usually, even if your buyer doesn't even ask you for a pro forma invoice, you want to go ahead and use it. Okay. Usually, it'll be the basis of the commercial invoice, which is the final sale. So, you kind of get all the things worked out on the pro forma invoice, and then you create the commercial invoice, which is the actual final sale or bill of sale. The pro forma invoice is not that. We've had so many companies say, well, I gave the buyer my pro forma invoice and they gave it back and say they need the commercial invoice, of course, just when the product is shipped. That is right. You need to go ahead and have that commercial invoice. Someone has a question about, sorry, it's like, I don't know if I have ADD or not, but the thing popped up. So bear with me. Great presentation. Thanks. Question: which free or low cost tool to do market research analysis? Okay. So Alejandro, I'm so sorry. That is, we teach a whole like course on it that we provide all these tools. And so I'm gonna just be in the interest of time here to tell you to go ahead and sign up for our full course that's coming May 8th, 15th, and 22nd. We show you a whole bunch, I mean, probably about 8 or 9 tools that you do market research with, all for free. So I just want to, that's such a hard answer for me to kind of answer right here, Alejandro. So I hope that's helpful. But there are a lot of tools out there. But my probably best answer would be to go ahead and take that course. Because it'll be just too hard for me to even get started here. And for that course, I actually go on the internet and I show you exactly how to do it. And you have a handout with all the links later. So that's the best way. But there are a lot of tools out there for free for you to pull tons of data. Oh, going the wrong way. All right. So going back into this topic, usually pro forma invoice will include more details than you're used to when you're writing quotations. And, there's a lot more steps you want to talk about and you want to go into for the pro forma invoice. But the extra detail can save time and prevent errors later on. So the 2 main things you want to consider though before you do your pro forma invoice, and this is so important, it literally has to be before. You don't just want to be filling it out and thinking it, on the slide. The main thing is your pricing strategy. You should already know your pricing strategy before you put it in the pro forma invoice, right? You should have already considered your market, objectives, your competitors, all that kind of stuff before you get to the pro forma invoice stage, right? So you can just insert the price that you know is not going to make you lose money and still going to be competitive. The second one is you want to think about the level of risk for your shipment. And that's where the Incoterm comes in, right? So in the pro forma invoice, you're going to insert an Incoterm. We'll talk about that right now. But understanding the Incoterm and understanding what it means to you is so important before you put it in that pro forma invoice, just like the pricing strategy. So let's talk about Incoterms. Once again, this is very high level, but it spells out which parties are responsible to pay and assume risk at each stage of the international transit of goods. Okay. So literally when you ship your product, so once again, this is after you found your buyer, and you're happy. So now it's time for you to ship that product, right? And so the Incoterm spells out who's responsible for each step. So the steps include, let's say, the product going from your facility to the US port. That's one step. The product actually sitting at the port. That's another step. The product getting on the ship. Let's say you're doing by ship. That's another step. The product crossing the water. That's another step. The product getting off the ship. That's another step. The product now actually clearing customs is another step. Then the product making its way to your buyer. All those steps, something can go wrong. We just saw with the Baltimore, right? Ship. All those steps, something can go wrong. And the Incoterm spells out, or something can go right, but the Incoterm spells out who is responsible. whose risk it is and who's responsible to pay at each one of those steps. So you don't have to negotiate with your buyer back and forth. Well, I'll go ahead and pay for it to go on. I'll go ahead and pay for it to go off. I'll go ahead to pay for insurance. The Incoterms tell you everything. So once you use that Incoterm right there, both sides know who's responsible for what. So it's very convenient, right? So it specify who's responsible for paying for managing the shipment, insurance, documentation, customs clearance, and logistical activities, all that great stuff. So I'm not going to go over all of them. That's for the next class or the other class, but high level. So one example was XWorks, right? So XWorks, XW, the buyer is responsible to pay for picking up the product at your facility. But they're responsible for everything else. Insurance, arranging customs clearance, duties. All you do is say, buyer, you come and you pick up this product, or have your, freight forwarder, or, whoever, pick up this product at my facility at 12 p.m. on Thursday. That's all you do. And the buyer is responsible for everything else. That's XWorks. There is a term for that. And some people ship only XWorks. They say some exporters are like, I don't want to handle all the rest. I only do XWorks. Now that will greatly limit your opportunities, but some people only do it this way, right? So the direct opposite is DDP, duties delivered paid, or delivered duties paid. So here is the direct opposite. The seller, you, is responsible for delivering the goods at each step of the way, all the way to the buyer's place of business. That means you're even paying for the taxes and clearing customs, something that you would never do normally. Normally, the importer pays the tariffs, right? But if you select DDP as an Incoterm, now you're responsible. So understanding the difference is very important, right? And then there's different levels in between because each step is a step. So you must understand the terms of sale or Incoterm before you use them in a quotation or pro forma invoice. Once again, this is high level. Please take the course to learn a lot more. But I'll go ahead and say, this is a chart we use in the course, but, just kind of showing you at a glance. XWorks, like I showed you, the buyer, not you. You just say, kind of get it at my facility at 11 p.m. on Thursday, and they're responsible for loading on the truck, clearing the customs here in the U.S., driving it to the port in the U.S., unloading it at the port, and then loading it on the ship at the port in the U.S. and crossing the ocean, and then unloading it at the port of export, and then loading it, onto the truck, and then taking it all of that the buyer's responsible for, and insurance, and customs clearance, and taxes, right? And then if you choose another term, which we're not going to go over in detail here, then there's varying, responsibilities for the F terms and the C terms and the D terms. And the complete opposite, like I just showed you, the two extremes, DDP, which is delivered duties paid. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see the word seller, right? In that case, the seller, you, is responsible for each step all the way. And as you can see, normally it is the buyer's responsibility to clear customs. And it's the buyer's responsibility to pay the import taxes or the tariffs. But here, if you choose this one, you're responsible. Right? So very important to understand how you use these before you use them. That's my main point here. So I digress. Once again, this is a high level course and you can't talk about all of them, but this is something you need to understand before you use it. Finally, the commercial invoice, that is, like I said, the final bill of sale. So once all the terms are agreed upon, you're ready to export your product, you create the commercial invoice, and that's the actual document that'll go along with the shipment that they actually use to assess the taxes and assess the pricing so they can price it based on the taxes, and make sure everything's okay. Is the legal document between the seller and the buyer describing the goods and the price, key documents for customs clearance and determining the customs and duties, right? The prices they're going to charge at the border, and typically includes many of the same details in the pro forma invoice. Normally, I'll show you examples in the main course. You'll see all the examples here, but this is high level, so that's just kind of general information about the commercial invoice. So considerations when shipping abroad. Okay, I'm going to race through this. You have to consider packaging, labeling, insurance requirements, and regulations, right? Remember, this is when you're actually shipping your products. So the main thing you want to really make sure you're considering is that the package is correctly packaged, right? Your package is packaged correctly, so it arrives in good condition, it's labeled correctly. Sometimes there's regulations that makes you have certain labels, right? So you want to make sure you check those foreign import requirements, but label correctly anyway. If it's, this side up, are fragile or anything like that, so that the goods are handled properly, arrive on time in the right place, documented correctly to meet U.S. and foreign government requirements, i.e., if there's a certificate required or so many other things that can be required, which you will figure out with the foreign import requirements. And then you want to have it insured. And as we didn't really see that carefully, but usually the insurance falls with the Incoterm. There's some Incoterms that make you require for insurance. There's some Incoterms that make the buyer require, have to pay for insurance. So, but you want to make sure that there is insurance, right, to cover against damage and pilferage and that kind of stuff. So let's talk about the freight forwarder. Normally, like I said, in that main course, we'll invite a freight forwarder. So you kind of pick her brain, but it's so important. And I always say the freight forwarder is your friend. The freight forwarder is your friend. If you don't have a good freight forwarder, you need to go ahead and find one that you can really utilize. Maybe a smaller freight forwarder, or something like that. A company where you can have that one-on-one customer service, so you can ask them questions. They can really help you, because it's really invaluable when you're trying to export. So it's an agent that ships cargo to an overseas destination. They're normally familiar with the foreign country's import rules and regulations, U.S. government regulations, different shipping methods, and necessary documentation. Now, you are ultimately responsible for knowing all your documentation. So let's say you need a certificate and the freight forwarder didn't tell you, and you didn't check the foreign import requirements. You can't be like, well, that freight forwarder didn't tell me I need the certificate. You're ultimately responsible. But a lot of times they will have tools too that can help you kind of be a check and balance on, oh, you need to make sure you have that certificate, or, oh, do you have that? Okay. Usually you want a licensed one, because if not, you're just kind of paying a broker who's using a licensed freight forwarder. So you want to make sure that you have one that's licensed by the International Air Transport Association for air freight, or the Federal Maritime Commission. They can usually assist with important things like freight costs, port charges, cost of special documentation, insurance costs, and their own handling fees, because of course they're not free. They charge you a little bit. They also can assist with recommending and assisting about packaging. Once again, packaging is getting more and more complicated. So you want a friend who can give you recommendations and look at the foreign import requirements yourself, right? Reviewing the letter of credit, that's very important. There can be discrepancies, and the freight forwarder can help you with the letter of credit. Say, oh no, this time cannot be met. Oh no, this port isn't really good to fly, to send your product out of. Make sure you have a freight forwarder who can look at your letters of credit, your commercial invoices, and that kind of stuff. They can reserve a space on board an ocean vessel, arrange with customs brokers to ensure compliance with customs regulations. Like I said before from that question, a lot of times they'll have their built-in kind of system, but a lot of smaller ones or more flexible ones can go ahead and use the customs broker that your buyer is accustomed to. They can prepare bill of lading, special documents, have goods shipped within a specific time frame, and tell you if the time frame is not realistic, so you're not promising things that can't be delivered on time, right? And they can also forward documents to a variety of people. Like if your bank needs a document, or some kind of letter of credit that's involved, they can forward a lot of documents as needed. So we won't talk about the customs broker in great detail. Usually I do, for the longer class, but really, once again, they're on the ground to kind of help get the product in, to pay the taxes and that kind of stuff. Modes of transportation, normally there's only three, unless there's some space travel going on or something like that. But usually there's land, air, and sea maritime. Each of them have their benefits, or the difficulties, and you want to weigh the cost, the time frame, the weight, because sometimes depending on your product, the volume and the weight will, some process or some mode might be better than the other. And then also any additional needed transportation. So take, for instance, if you're going to ship your product via sea, normally there's a cost for you to have that, over the road, trucking costs from your actual facility over to the port. And that might be pretty expensive versus if you just need to go right over to the closest airport and ship it by air. right? So sometimes, your freight forwarder can go ahead and assess. You might think, oh, I'm just going to go ahead and ship by sea. That might be cheaper, but depending on your volume, depending on your weight, depending on, the amount of transportation you need to get to the port, depending on a whole bunch of, depending on your time frame, another method might be greater for you to use. And that's how your freight forwarder is your friend. And then that person can help you weigh the pros and cons. Very quickly, there can be tons of export shipping documentation that you might need to include. We talked about some of them, right? Like the various certificates. If you have to get a certificate of free sale or certificate, like a sanitary certificate, then those are the things that will accompany your shipment normally. Or sometimes they'll have like electronic way, method that they just kind of go automatically to the customs broker, electronically. But usually that's, something part of your shipment. But other documents can include commercial and consular invoices. That's very interesting. Some countries like the UAE and other Middle East countries and some countries in Africa, they require that your invoice, your commercial invoice, is actually consularized by a consulate in the US or the foreign country's embassy in the US. Can you imagine? So that actually takes time. Your freight forwarder can do that for you, but there's a cost associated and some time because they actually have to take your commercial invoice, send it over to the embassy or consulate, have them get it consularized, and have it send it back. So if you didn't look at the foreign import requirements, you didn't know that that was a requirement, and you're like promising, your buyer, oh, I'll get that to you right away. Now you have to do this whole process. So once again, checking the foreign import requirements, talking about it with your freight forwarder, he or she can usually do that for you, but that's something you need to think about. Pre-shipment inspections, like a sanitary certificate or something like that. Um, Various certificates, export controls, we're going to talk about really quickly, high level, and then documents used in the movement of goods, which we're going to talk about really fast. So the electronic export information system, the EI, this is really the only document that's really required by the US. That's shocking, isn't it? Everything else I'm talking about, this certificate, this inspection, this consularization, that's all required by the foreign country, not even the US. That's why you have to understand what the foreign country wants, right? This thing I'm talking to you right now, this electronic export information, right? This is the only, thing that you have to do that the US requires. Everything else is based on the foreign country. That's why I say, how do you export, Victoria? People ask me, export to where, I say, right? Because it's very important. But for the US, you need to go ahead and fill out this electronic export information system. It usually can be filed electronically by you, the business. Normally, your freight forwarder just takes care of it for you or another third party. There's a system set up by the Census Bureau called AES Direct that allows you to file this document electronically. And usually, if you are shipping food or food product or ag product, and you're not shipping it to an embargoed country or someplace with sanctions, you don't usually need an export license, right? So you won't have to get an export license from one of the agencies and include that in your shipment. However, if you have some kind of military use product, which is not likely with food, right? Or you're going to ship your product to some kind of country that there's some kind of sanction or embargo or something like that, then you will need an export license and you need to make sure that you understand how to get one and all that great stuff. Once again, this course is high level. We're talking about ag products normally are designated EAR 99, which means you don't need a license at all. So normally if you're going to have any kind of food product, you won't have to worry about this. You just have to fill out the form. But if you're going to ship, sometimes, people were shipping like flour to Cuba at one time. So they need an export license, or they're doing something with Iran or something. So you just have to know, make sure you kind of understand if you need an export license or not. And do your due diligence. So I'm going to say it again. The freight forwarder is your friend, and so is the customs broker. They may be familiar with these documents, but it's you, the exporter. You're ultimately responsible for the accuracy of these documents, right? So you make sure you have to really have a good understanding about them. Finally, very high level, we're going to just talk about some other shipping documentation, export packing list. Normally you'll have that when you export. It just kind of lists all the stuff in your package and in your shipment and the weights and that kind of stuff and the volume. And that's how they calculate, the volume and stuff and the weight for your shipment. Shipper's instructions, that's very important, because if you tell your freight forwarder you need all this stuff, I need it here, I need it put there, I need this sent to the baker, I need all this stuff, right? And they don't put it in the shipper's instruction, it never happened. It never happened. So if you are kind of talking to your freight forwarder and you have all these things that you need them to do and blah, 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 and all that, and you just, you have to make sure they're memorializes the shipper's instructions, because this is actually the document that actually captures all of the information so that your shipment will kind of go off to the way you expect. The bill of lading, this is pretty much, the bill, the contract between you and whoever's kind of shipping, like your the mode of transportation you're using, is kind of the contract between them, and you, the shipper. It's kind of complex, which we talk about it more in the other class. There's two different types, negotiable and non-negotiable. One is better to use with certain types of payments, like letters of credit. One's good to use for other types of payments. But, in basically there's a bill of lading that normally goes with each shipment. And then if you're shipping by air, you use the airway bill and not a bill of lading. So finally, types of payment options, last part of the course. There are several, and this is very important because you want to get paid, right? And you want to get paid on time. So this is a very important, topic. So there are a variety of payment tools depending on the level of trust that you have with the buyer and his credit worthiness, right? You have to make that that assessment, because when you choose some types of payments, you're pretty much extending credit to your buyer, and you need to say to yourself, is this buyer worthy of this credit I'm giving him or not? And if he's not worthy, is this bank worthy? Can I get a letter of credit from his bank, right? And if his bank is not worthy, maybe I can get a confirmed letter of credit where my US bank promises to pay if the buyer doesn't pay or his bank doesn't pay, right? So there's varying levels of what you can do. But the main underlining concept here is, do you trust this buyer to pay? And if not, you need to use certain types, right? And sometimes it's just a new buyer. There's no reason to not trust them. You just don't know them, right? So you want to maybe be kind of cautious. So here, ordered from the most secure for you to the least secure, you have cash in advance. This is the most secure for you as the exporter, right? Because you get your money up front. I like that, right? Give me my money up front. So if you got it like that, that's great. Sometimes if there's a lot of competition and your competitors are using some other form of payment, allow another form of payment that's more riskier, then you may not get many sales because they're like, well, why would I give you cash in advance when your competitor is willing to go ahead and do open account? So it's always a situation by situation, thing, right? So cash in advance is really great. Like they just right there, they pay in advance. That's great for you, but that really sucks for the exporter, right? So that gives you the least amount of risk, but the most, because the importer is going to give you money, trusting that you're going to send them something, right? So that's a risk on their part, right? So it's like an inverse relationship. The next is a letter of credit, right? So if you don't really trust the importer, but you trust his bank, then you can have his bank go ahead and issue a letter of credit, and that's like a promise to pay. So they'll go ahead and pay upon the receipt of documents showing that you shipped the product, right? You can also get a confirmed letter of credit. That's when your U.S. bank adds his, the bank adds its promise to pay just in case the other two don't pay. The next one going into more of a risk for you is documentary collection. Very similar to a letter of credit, but there's no promise to pay. Here, the bank, your bank and your buyer's bank are just shifting money and shifting documents around, but there's no promise to pay on their part, right? So it's like your bank will send documents showing that the shipment was made, so they can trust that gives importers some like, oh yeah, I know a shipment actually happened, and then the importer's bank in turn will go ahead and provide the funds, right? But there's no actual promise to pay on their behalf if the buyer doesn't pay. It's just really moving around documents and payments. This is very popular when we have our international banker come on. This is the number one kind of method or tool that a lot of experts, because it's much cheaper than letters of credit, and you still have that reassurance, right? That that a payment will come. Um, and as long as you see the shipment documents. So open account, that is, of course, the most risky for you. That's pretty much, you're kind of saying, okay, I'm shipping the documents, you can pay 90 days later, right? So, of course, that is ultimate risk. However, if you're in a competitive market and everyone else is doing open account and your buyer is like, well, you better do open account too, because why would I choose you, right? Then you might have to do it. If that is the case, then that's just a risk you might have to take. But if you're going to do that, you want to consider export. You want to consider credit insurance from the Exim Bank. Okay, and so that will kind of help you kind of cover your losses in the event that the buyer defaults. But you never just want to do open account by itself. You also want to try to see if you can couple it with some kind of mitigating kind of resource. So very quickly, the foreign exchange issues, that's a big topic because, you can choose different options for currency, right? You can say, well, only pay in the US, or I only want people to pay US dollar. That's great. That's a preferred, currency. But let's be truthful. You have a buyer that's in the EU and the Eurozone, and they're like, well, I mean, I have so many different, competitors of yours who's willing to pay me in the euro or willing to let me pay in the euro. Why do I need to kind of bother with your US dollar? So it's situation by situation, but that's something you have to think about. Normally, you do want to demand that they pay in US dollar, but that doesn't always mean the case, right? There's two parties to every transaction. So if there happens to be, someone demanding that you go ahead and pay in their local currency, that's fine. You just have to understand the risk, right? And you have to understand the tools to minimize the risk. The tools to minimize the risk, a lot of times your international banker can give you a forward contract that will lock in a rate at a certain date, so that you won't have like wild swings, right? And the currency where, now, their currency is so devalued, against the dollar that now they can't even afford to pay now or something like that, right? So, and let's talk about payment problems because those are real, right? Not every buyer is going to be perfect. Not everybody's going to pay you right on time. So the main thing is to avoid non-payment issues. That's always the first thing we want to do. But the option in the event of non-payment, you want to think about it. What should you do, right? You want to work with the buyer, especially if it's no fault to his own. If he's in a country that just experienced some crazy, natural disaster, look at Dubai right now, right? I mean, it's flooded and just I was just there honestly 2 weeks ago and it was perfect, right? And so now maybe there's some issue that he can't pay or something like that, or some political unrest just popped up, and then if there's still a good faith, but there's a situation that he can't pay, try to work it out, and you need to want to go ahead and look at some options in the event of non-payment. And sometimes you can do mediation or arbitration, but having some kind of good faith and understanding between you and the buyer goes a long way. So finally, just high level, if you need some kind of financing and credit insurance options, the Exim Bank has a variety of financing, programs for, new to export companies. And they have credit insurance. So once again, if you are using an open account, you want to, contact the Exim Bank to inquire about their credit insurance so that you have some safeguards there in case they don't pay. The SBA has different types of loan. They have working capital loan program. They have other loan programs that might be interested. And once again, this is high level, but if you just kind of look on their website, if you're interested, you can kind of see. And then finally, the USDA has an export guarantee, credit guarantee programs. This is a very limited program. And so it's very limited in scope, very limited in eligibility, but they do have a program available. But once again, you want to go ahead and check it out and look at the rules and, where they're able to use it and which countries and that kind of stuff. So this has been a very high overview. I keep saying that because, like Danielle knows, I feel so bad because I feel like I really want to go in so much deeper. But for an hour and so, it's been an hour and 20 minutes for this course. I did the best I could. But last thing, make sure you sign up. Sign up for the session coming up and on May 8th, 15th, and 22nd. Just reach out to Danielle and she can kind of help you with that. So I just want to leave you with that. So any questions, let me know.
Yep,
Uh,
looks like we have a few. And yes, I'll reach out to everybody by email after this, and I'll include a link to the spring export readiness training in case you're interested.
yeah, and I think
Uh,
all of those I've answered already going through those current
yeah,
questions.
yep. I know. Any other questions? I know, so much information.
I know. You're like brain dead. Everyone's like fried right
Yes.
now. I get it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for everything, Victoria.
Thank you.
Always informative. Yes. Great. And yes, I'll be in touch later today, as I said, over email. Oh,
Is there a question there?
yes, I was asked for a certificate of free sale for each order. Is this correct?
So you were asked for a certificate of free sale. Free. Okay. So are you saying if you actually ship to a foreign country? So if you're act yes, if you ship to a foreign country, then yes, normally if you're shipping for those goods, then yes, they are going to require a certificate of free sale, for you to ship to that country, depending on the country though. And then typically you can kind of ask your buyer on the ground. Normally, I believe the FDA might have them available where they issue it for a certain amount of time, but that's something you can also just double check with your buyer to see if you need one for each time, or whether you can have one that stands for a certain amount of time for a certain amount of shipments, because it's the same product. But yes, normally if the foreign import requirements require a certificate of free sale, you normally will have to include it in the order. But once again, you can ask your buyer whether there is availability for one to kind of stand for several of them. So,
And then
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll put the recording of the webinar and presentation in. If you log into your MySesta account, there's a section that's past webinars, and it'll be there later today.
All right. I hope this was helpful. Once again, this was so high level. So please take the time. If you cannot make it spring, you see these dates and you're like, oh no, I can't make it, all those dates. That's fine. We also offer one in the fall. Just throw that out there. But, once again, and we're filling up very fast for the spring. But this is just a resource that we're so happy to offer SESTA members. And once again, if you take the full course, you get handouts and all that great stuff too. So, but thank you for joining. Let's see. There's another
Great.
question. Oh, thank you
Yes.
both for your time. Oh, already signed up.
Yep,
Yay.
great. All
Perfect.
right. Yeah. Thank you. And thanks, Victoria. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye
Take care.
bye.